Hey folks, Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and today I'm doing yet another installment of the Freelancer Q&A series that I do at least most weeks. This week's edition, you can see if my mic is good enough to block out the toddler that's running up and down the hall having a fit for some reason. So it'll be a nice Easter egg if you get to hear that. Anyway, on this edition, I am going to do another one of the series where I evaluate a niche idea. For those of you who haven't caught the other videos, basically a few years ago on my blog, deadtech.com, at one point I asked the readership if they wanted to submit niche ideas, and we could do a series of kind of like case studies on whether they seemed like they might be viable or not. I mean, just my opinion, obviously, but people were interested in this. And I never really got around to answering all of these. There were a lot of people that wrote in with niche ideas, and this was essentially the reason for it was I was creating a lot of content that was trying to explain how one might select a niche or what have you, and realized at some point that it's hard to describe in the abstract, and it's maybe easier to work through with a series of examples of what are good and maybe not as good niche ideas. So, all of that out of the way, the actual question came from someone who submitted 3 different niche ideas. And I'm going to start with the one that I feel like would be the biggest slog and work through the other couple over the next few installments of this. And so this one is, I'm trying to find it among the 3. I help enterprise clients design automation systems to save developer and QA toil. So the idea would be the niche, I guess the folks that need this are anyone in the enterprise that has developers and QA, and those folks are experiencing some form of toil. So what is my take on this as an idea for starting a business? I think, first of all, this would be quite a slog. So as I said, of the 3 ideas that this person submitted, this is the one I would probably most stay away from. And it's not that I don't think you could iterate from this to something that would be easier to start a business based on. It's just that this particular thing, boy, it seems like it would be tough. So let me kind of talk through why that is. Philosophically, one thing I've kind of learned in my long, slow transition from programmer to being a soulless executive is that as I look back on from whence I came, if you will, in the programmer world, programmers, me included, for all the years, tend to have this, automate first and ask questions later. So if you see something that is less efficient than it could be, you have this sense, like this impulse to be like, no, I can make this faster. And in my experience, a lot of developers gravitate right away to like, how could I automate this thing? And consequently, assume that a lot of non-automated things are simply because someone didn't think you could or didn't know how. So there's this kind of subconscious mindset of like, well, obviously nobody's explained to anybody before that this could be automated. And even like XKCD land, where you have that chart that like shows whether something's worth automating or not, like how often do you do it and how long does it take, how long would it take you to automate it. I think that even like in a sense, I mean, it's a funny chart and it's kind of true, it is true. Like he does the math on when things are worth automating, but in another way, not really, and it almost in my mind misses the point, because it isn't a strict like time savings, like, oh, well, if you are going to spend this amount of time doing the thing and the time it would take you to automate it is less than over the course of this time, then you obviously do it. And maybe he never intended the comic that way. It was just to, show when it literally would take you more time to automate than not. But the reason I say that that misses the point is because it misses concerns like, does anybody care if this person is executing their tasks in substandard fashion? Or maybe a little less cynically, is it worth undertaking all the rigmarole of automation and then of maintenance to save this person some time? And the answer to that can generally be no, for a lot of different reasons. It might be worth it in the short term to do some kind of automation just from a sheer like time trade-off perspective. But if that automation that gets done is confusing or has like a high maintenance footprint or a high risk, you might just say like, yeah, it's not optimal that Steve over here has to type things in a few times a week, but oh, well, the cost of solving that problem just in the end isn't really worth taking on the problem. If you want like a real world field example, there was a time when I actually, over the years, coming from an automation background, have become one of the most resistant to automation because with my practice involving legacy code and things of that nature, I learned the hard way a lot of times just how much cost there is around having automated things and then like later maintaining them and understanding them and changing them. When you automate something and do a little bit of documentation of it, you are sort of casting that process in stone. So if it's a suboptimal process and you automate that suboptimal process, now not only do you have some janky automation, but you have like human resistance to making changes because the person responsible for the automation has to make changes. The person responsible for documenting it has to make changes. So you become sort of entrenched in this substandard process because it's not worth disturbing it. There can also be, like out of sight, out of mind type things. So I remember working with somebody for a bit of time that was like big on no code solutions and was always suggesting like, oh, we could create a Zap for this or, whatever. And I was like, all right, you're going to create a Zap for something. We're all going to forget this existed in 3 months. It's going to break in 2 years and nobody is going to have any idea how to fix it. And that is not worth saving somebody 5 minutes of data entry. So anyway, let me get off that tangent. But the reason I went into all that is because I think the idea of like there are developers out there and QA people engaging in Toil, and I'm going to come in and do something about it, sort of speaks to that context-free, like automation is good in all scenarios if somebody is toiling somewhere. It goes against the grain of a lot of potentially savvy business folks in the mix who might see a bigger picture here and might understand that there might be all manner of reasons that nobody's ever added some kind of source control plugin or something that actually more than offset the value of whatever that would be. So in order for this to work, in order for this niche to work, you would have to overcome a lot of kind of specific issues, but the biggest one would be that you might often find yourself in a situation where the automation that you were coming in to do, assuming you could sell this, wouldn't be worth doing it to the organization. It would actually have a negative ROI, even though it was letting, a developer do their work slightly faster each week. So, especially because it's so vague, it's hard to know whether that would be the case or not. Let me, I guess, talk through some issues that I can think of with this niche and kind of just, against the backdrop that I was just talking about and in a sort of sequential order that I noted here. So we're talking about a service provider coming into the enterprise and eliminating some form of developer toil or QA toil. The first question that I would ask is, why can't the developers do that themselves? Like, why? I mean, they're also professional automators like the question asker here. So why wouldn't they be just as well equipped to do this toil elimination as somebody going into this niche? Secondly, let's assume they weren't. Let's assume that you got pretty good at some kind of specific toil elimination. The developers are still likely to be blockers because think about, imagine that you're a developer in the enterprise and they bring some other developer in to, I guess, build something for the developers there to use. I think you're going to get a lot of pushback when the director comes in and says, hey, I'm going to hire this person to like automate some of your tasks. I imagine those people are going to say, don't do that. I can automate my own tasks. I mean, maybe not, but that would be something that you are likely to encounter. Now, let's say that neither one of those things is true. The developers, for whatever reason, can't automate this themselves, and they're happy to have the automation in place. Now, if we go up the org chart a little, how is somebody who would buy this, like probably a VP or a director, how is that person going to be aware that this is a problem? And I mean, there are ways that that could happen if the developers were constantly complaining up to their skip level or whoever that something sucked, they might become aware of it. So let's say they are aware. Why wouldn't they just assume that somehow this problem can be solved internally? Now, maybe they assume that the developers can do it and the developers say, oh, no, actually, we can't. You should bring in an expert. I guess maybe. But if I were the VP, that's probably not my next move. Instead, I would say, like, Well, okay, maybe we can get a different piece of software and eliminate this toil. Maybe we can simply, stop requiring people to do TPS reports. There would probably be a lot of different like org fixes that we could bring into place to fix the problem. Not the least of which, incidentally, is if I have a bunch of developers that can't automate stuff, I might get new developers. So you're going to have to convince this VP that there's a problem, and then also convince this VP that there's no way short of bringing you in to solve this problem. And then finally, let's say that you had a way to do all this. Like, how would you find these people and market to them? All we know is that they're in the enterprise, and essentially, like, you'd have a landing page saying, like, are your developers doing a lot of tasks they find tedious, or are your developers like working inefficiently? It seems like it would be hard to create a really like crisp and resonant message to get through to people versus if you had some kind of specialty where you did something super specific, like if there were secrets showing up in source control or something, you came in and very quickly detected all of them and eliminated them from the entire history in one fell swoop. Whether that's a viable niche or not, maybe there's tooling that makes that insanely easy to do. I don't know, but it would be a super easy thing to market. So something like eliminating developer toil in the enterprise, not really. So, I don't want to belabor the point here, but those are kind of a list of issues that just occurred to me in like 5 minutes as I was like reading through this and thinking about the video, and I just jotted them down. So obviously this isn't like even a very well constructed or thought out list. There's going to be a lot of issues here. And I think a lot of them are related to like, let me transition now into talking about how I might refine this to make things easier on yourself if you're going to try to go this route. I think a lot of issues with this are related to a lack of specificity. So the first thing I might consider doing is zooming in a little bit on the company itself. So enterprise covers a lot of ground. Are we talking about a government enterprise? Are we talking about banks? Are we talking about heavily regulated organizations that are dealing with like health information or personally identifying information? And then as you start to dig into that, you can get maybe into the kind of toil. So if you're talking about heavily regulated industries, maybe this isn't specifically automation related toil. Like maybe the developers there are having to fill out a lot of reports related to compliance or things of that nature. So if you start to get more specific about the enterprise itself, you can get more specific about the toil and about the expertise required to address it. So that's the first thing I might consider, is seeing how much you can zoom in, and not just enterprise, but vertical or type of organization or what have you in the enterprise. Number two, I would say zoom in on the person doing the toiling. And these are not mutually exclusive. You could zoom in on all these fronts, but if you zoom in on the toiler, first of all, QA or developer, right? If you are saying, those people do very different things all day, every day. So if you're saying either or, you kind of don't have a specific thing that you're doing. So first of all, pick one. And then if you're picking a developer, is it a web developer, front-end developer, full stack, server side developer, embedded developer? So start to get more specific about the developer or QA, and you're going to start to get more specific about the toil because you're looking for patterns. I bet the kind of toil that a front end developer has to go through is, I imagine it involves CSS. Been out of the game for a while, but there's probably a lot of toil related to design and moving pixels around and stuff, so that's going to be a lot different than the kind of toil related to, working on some kind of embedded device or something like that. All of those things probably have flavors of toil, but the more specific that you get about that, the easier it's going to be to identify problems and market solutions for them. Part and parcel with both of those is zooming in on the nature of the toil itself. I would probably do the first two things first, because if you just zoom in on the toil and say like, well, I'm going to help any organization where a developer is filling out too many reports. Again, that's going to get hard to market because that's just like any organization. But if you're zooming in on, front end developers, or let me give a better example than that. Like maybe they're doing like back office or line of business type stuff internally. They work for a bank and they're, back office developers using server-side languages, and they're doing a lot of, custom coding in some scripting language or something to like supplement their basic work to move data around from environment to environment. Now you're getting kind of pretty specific here. So writing a lot of script to move data or scripts to move data around, that's a pretty specific kind of toil. Once you've zoomed in on some front or some nature on one or more of these things, now you can start to content market, for instance. Like you can talk a lot about creating and replacing scripts of this nature, reducing them in size, recognizing when you have a problem, etc. So you'll also probably be able to zoom in on the focus or the problems caused by the existence of this toil. So if you're just generally going to go anywhere and help anyone who has developers that are toiling or QA that are toiling, it's really going to be hard to explain what you're doing in a sales context or anything like that, versus if you're a lot more specific about it, you can say, like, these are the problems that typically come up when this is going on. If you have all these extra scripts, here's what you're going to notice. So you can explain it in a way that the developers or QA or whoever themselves can identify. But also, crucially, once you're more specific and you can recognize patterns in the problems and solutions, you'll be able to explain it to executives like, hey, you might not be aware of this, but if you see these 3 signs, there's a pretty good chance your developers are spending way too much time writing ad hoc code to move data around. And there are some pretty simple ways that you can address that. And by the way, if you address that, you're going to wind up with a lot less personally identifying information stored in environments where it doesn't belong. You're going to, have a lot less security vulnerability, whatever the case may be. You can start to map it to things that executives would care about. And that really is pretty important, climbing the org chart in this fashion. You need to think about what executives care about. And I'm going to let you in on something that might be like kind of a surprising secret. Most people that are individual contributors in the organization or haven't presided over a level of the organization that has a budget are kind of skewed in how important cost savings is to an executive. Now, the easiest way I've ever heard developers make a business case for everything they do is, well, if we automate this, we will save a certain amount of developer time. And that means that, they'll have this amount of time freed up, or in theory, you could spend a little bit less money on your developers per year, relatively speaking, spend less money. The thing is, executives tend not, in my experience anyway, and also as an executive, I don't care about this. If you tell me that right now in Hit Subscribe, we're spending a little bit too much money on our CRM, we're spending a little bit too much money on, that we're having too many rounds of editorial or something, I don't care. It's just not that compelling a problem to me. And the reason for that is budgets. I care when something goes over budget, but if something is within budget, if it's not ticking a yellow or red light, and it's not causing an immediate problem for me, I've got other stuff to worry about than like, well, I'm 4% over budget, but I could be 6%, or sorry, 4% under budget, but I could be 6% under budget. I 100% do not care. That is not, there's no problem I have. I have more important things to do than worry about slight cost savings somewhere. And that's the thing that I think a lot of folks misunderstand about the executive, is the degree to which this business case of things could be a little more efficient is important to them. And the answer is almost universally not important unless they're over budget or beyond some boundary that they're not supposed to be, unless it's causing a problem that's more immediate to them. So for instance, if you're talking about developer toil, you have to think about what would make an executive care. It's not that their developers are slightly less efficient than they could be. If that toil is causing mistakes in addressing things like vulnerabilities, if it's causing mistakes in addressing things like compliance, if it's causing, production rollouts to faceplant, those are the kind of things executives care about. So you need to be able to zoom in on the nature of the toil, so much so that you can figure out how somebody could identify signs of it from afar, and also figure out how to explain to an executive why they will care about the toil. And it's almost certainly not going to be a time savings thing. It's going to be mistakes. It's going to be embarrassing things that happen that put egg on the face of the broader organization. So that is why I don't think that this would be my niche, or why I'd say it's not that like what you've described, eliminating toil in this fashion, can't be the start towards filling some valuable niche and having a good business, but it's certainly not the finish. You're going to have to get more specific in various ways in order to make this work, in my opinion. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to convince. And I mean, I just don't think it would get off the ground to go and pitch an executive on, hey, your developers are toiling away in some way that I could automate. I think that's going to be an almost impossible sale everywhere you go. So get more specific, and get more specific about the company and or the nature of the toil and or the nature of the person doing the toil. Because once you do that, that's where you're going to start to identify patterns and how you can implement this and how you can do things efficiently, but also patterns in what to look for to recognize that you have a problem and why an executive or a buyer should care about it. So hopefully all of that makes sense, and I will catch you all next time.